blizzards usually bring death, but for Martha Higgins, one brought 20 Hell's Angels to her doorstep. Facing a choice between fear and mercy, she opened her home to the world's most feared bikers. Their stunning act of gratitude shattered the town's prejudice and rewrote the definition of family forever. The wind howling through the Colorado Rockies sounded like a dying animal, but 62-year-old Martha Higgins barely registered the noise. It had been 8 months since her husband Ethan passed away from a sudden heart attack, leaving her entirely alone in their isolated farmhouse just off US Route 50, near the treacherous incline of Monarch Pass. The town of Oak Haven lay 5 miles down the mountain, a tight-knit, deeply judgmental community that had long whispered that Martha was too old and too frail to maintain the property by herself. That night, the weather forecasters had warned of a once-in-a-generation whiteout, predicting temperatures plunging to 20 below zero. Martha had stoked the wood stove, wrapped herself in Ethan's old flannel quilt, and prepared to wait it out. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural vibration that rattled the window panes and vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like rolling thunder, which was impossible in the dead of winter. Martha clutched her quilt tighter, peering through the frosted glass of her living room window. Headlights, dozens of them. They were cutting through the blinding horizontal snow like the glowing eyes of predators, creeping slowly up her long unpaved driveway. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Nobody came up this road in a storm, not unless they were lost or desperate. As the machines rumbled to a halt in her front yard, the headlights cut out, and through the swirling white flakes she saw the silhouettes. Massive, broad-shouldered figures dismounting from heavy cruisers. A heavy gloved fist pounded on her heavy oak front door. Bang, 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 bang. Martha's trembling hand reached for the landline, but the line was dead. The ice had taken down the phone lines miles ago. She was completely cut off. Swallowing her terror, she walked to the door, peering through the peephole. A giant of a man stood on her porch. Ice coated his long, graying beard, and snow was caked into the deep creases of his leather jacket. Even through the distorted glass, Martha could clearly make out the infamous winged death head patch on his chest. The rocker below it read, "Hell's Angels." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. The stories she had heard on the local news about biker gangs, the violence, the outlaws, the terrifying unpredictability flooded her mind. Sheriff Boyd Miller, Oak Haven's heavy-handed lawman, had warned the town for years about the criminal element passing through their mountain roads. The man knocked again, a little weaker this time. "Ma'am," a deep, raspy voice called out over the wind. "Please." Martha hesitated. If she opened the door, she was letting 20 outlaws into her home. If she didn't, 20 men were going to freeze to death on her front lawn. She looked at Ethan's empty armchair. Her husband had been a mechanic, a man who loved the road and the machines that conquered it. "No one dies on our doorstep, Martha," she could almost hear him say. With shaking hands, she unbolted the lock and pulled the heavy door open. The wind instantly ripped into the hallway, bringing with it the smell of exhaust, wet leather, and freezing men. The giant on the porch took a step back, holding his hands up to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. His lips were dangerously blue. "I'm Jim," the man said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Jim Castiglione, my chapter. We got caught blind by the pass. The road is completely iced over. 3 of my boys laid their bikes down in the snowdrifts. We can't make it to town. If we stay out here, we're dead." Martha looked past him. 19 other men were huddled together against the biting wind, trying to shield themselves behind the heavy frames of their Harley-Davidsons. They looked terrifying, covered in tattoos, scars, and heavy chains, but right now they just looked like shivering, dying boys. "Bring them in," Martha said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Bring them all in, but tell them to wipe their boots." Jim stared at her for a split second, shock registering in his dark eyes, before he turned and whistled sharply. "Inside. Now." One by one, the Hells Angels filed into Martha's pristine, floral wallpapered home. The contrast was absurd and terrifying. The swaggering entrim, the powering, heavily armed bikers. They filled the living room, the hallway, and the kitchen. The sheer physical presence of them was suffocating. Leather creaked, heavy boots thudded against the hardwood, and a metallic clink of chains and belt buckles echoed in the quiet house. Martha locked the door behind the last man. She was trapped. She had just willingly locked herself in an isolated cabin with 20 members of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world. The first hour was tense, fraught with a thick, suffocating silence. The men stood awkwardly in the living room, melting snow pooling around their heavy boots, clearly unsure of how to behave in the delicate environment. They looked around at the doilies, the porcelain figurines, and the framed needlepoint on the walls with a mixture of confusion and cautious respect. "Take your jackets off. Put them in the mudroom," Martha ordered, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her fear. "There are extra blankets in the hall closet. And putting on a pot of coffee and whatever soup I have left." Jim Castiglione stepped forward, removing his soaking wet leather cup with a heavy sigh. Underneath his arms were a canvas of faded ink. "We don't want to impose, Mrs. Higgins, Martha Higgins," she replied briskly, marching into the kitchen. "And it's too late to worry about imposing, Mr. Burse Castiglione. You're already dripping on my Persian rug." To her surprise, a low chuckle rippled through the freezing men. A massive, bald biker with a jagged scar across his neck, whom the others called Tiny, immediately dropped to his knees with a towel, aggressively scrubbing the water out of the rug. For the next 2 hours, Martha worked tirelessly. She emptied her pantry, throwing together a massive pot of venison stew, a reserve of chili Ethan had frozen months ago, and brewed pot after pot of black coffee. The man ate ravenously, sitting on the floor leaning against the walls out of sheer exhaustion. As the chaotic hunger subsided, the tension in the room began to thaw. Martha sat in her rocking chair, sipping her tea, watching the intruders. They weren't trashing the place. They were speaking in hushed, respectful tones, occasionally shooting her grateful glances. Jim walked over, holding a delicate china teacup filled to the brim with black coffee, looking completely absurd in his massive, calloused hands. He pointed to a framed photograph on the mantel. It was Ethan in 1982, leaning proudly against a pristine, custom-built Harley-Davidson knucklehead. "Your husband had good taste," Jim said softly. "That's a beautiful machine. Panhead frame, knucklehead engine. He built it. Every boat." Martha smiled, a pang of grief hitting her chest. "He lived in the garage, loved that bike more than he loved his own knees." "He ride?" "Never in a club." "Never in a club," Martha clarified. "But he respected the road. He always said bikers were the only people left who understood loyalty." Jim nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "He was right, and we don't forget a kindness, Martha. What you're doing for us tonight. It means something." The peace, however, was shattered the next morning. The storm continued to rage, trapping them all for a second day. The landline miraculously gave a brief, stuttering ring. Martha answered it. It was Sheriff Boyd Miller. "Martha." Boyd's voice crackled through the static, sounding strained and angry. "Are you all right out there? We got a call from Gladys O'Rourke on the CB radio. She said before the snow blinded the valley she saw a pack of bikers turn up your ridge." The room went dead silent, 20 pairs of eyes locked onto Martha. The bikers tightened up, hands resting near their heavy belts. They knew exactly how small-town law enforcement treated them. Martha gripped the phone. She looked at Jim, who gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. He wasn't threatening her. He was pleading. If the sheriff came up here with a snowcat and deputies, there would be a standoff. "Bikers?" Martha forced a laugh. "Boyd, you know Gladys's eyesight is shot. It was just the county snowplows turning around at the edge of my property." "You sure, Martha?" Boyd pressed, his tone suspicious. Because if those filthy animals are anywhere near Oakhaven, I'm deputizing half the town and we're hunting them down. I won't have the Hells Angels bringing their drugs and violence into my jurisdiction. I'm perfectly safe, Boyd, just me and the snow. Martha lied smoothly, hanging up the phone before he could question her further. She turned around. Tiny was staring at her. His jaw dropped. Jim let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a minute. You just lied to the cops for us, a younger biker named Rusty muttered, bewildered. I lied to prevent a bloodbath in my living room, Martha corrected sharply, though her hands were shaking. Don't make me regret it. For 2 days and 2 nights, the Hells Angels lived in Martha Higgins' farmhouse. They chopped a week's worth of firewood, fixed a leak under her kitchen sink that had bothered her for months, and rehinned a heavy barn door that had blown loose in the wind. Despite their terrifying exteriors, they treated her with the kind of deferential reverence usually reserved for royalty. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. The sun blinded the snow-covered valley, and the distant rumble of the county plows signaled that the highway was clear. The men suited up, firing up their frozen engines, the roar echoing off the mountain. Jim stood on the porch, looking at Martha. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills, attempting to press it into her hand. Martha immediately pushed it away. Put your dirty money away, Jim Castiglione. I didn't save your lives for cash. Jim studied her face, realizing she was entirely serious. He slowly pocketed the money. He stepped closer, taking her fragile hands in his massive ones. The world's a cruel place for a woman alone, Martha, Jim said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. You ever need anything? Anything at all. You don't call the cops. You don't call the town. You call us. With a final nod, he walked to his bike, kicked it into gear, and led the roaring procession down the mountain. Martha watched them leave, the silence of the valley rushing back in to swallow the noise. She was relieved they were gone. But as she walked back into her empty house, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had fundamentally changed. She just didn't realize how soon that promise would be tested, or how viciously the town of Oakhaven was about to turn on her. The secret didn't last a week. In a town like Oakhaven, where the population hovered just under 2,000, gossip was the primary currency, and Gladys O'Rourke was its wealthiest merchant. The snow had barely melted from the pines when the whispers began. It started at the local diner, passed over plates of eggs and black coffee, and then spread to the aisles of the grocery store. Martha Higgins harbored a biker gang. The rumor was confirmed when Sheriff Boyd Miller drove his cruiser up Martha's muddy driveway 4 days after the storm. He didn't come to check on her well-being. He came with a plastic evidence bag. Martha opened the door to find the sheriff standing on her porch, his jaw set in a hard, furious line. He held up the clear bag. Inside was a heavy silver Zippo lighter, deeply engraved with the winged death head and the word Oakland. Found this half buried in the ice by your mailbox, Martha, Boyd said, his voice dripping with condescension. Now, unless Ethan had a secret life we didn't know about, I'd say Gladys wasn't seeing snowplows. Martha stared at the lighter. Rusty, the young biker, had been frantically searching his pockets for it before they left. She looked Boyd dead in the eye, her posture straightening. A group of men were freezing to death, Boyd. I gave them shelter. It's what any decent Christian woman would do. Decent? Boyd scoffed, his face flushing red. They're a criminal enterprise, Martha. Drug runners, extortionists, thugs. You lied to my face, hindered a potential police investigation, and brought trash into Oakhaven. People are furious. They were polite, they were respectful, and they left without a trace of trouble. Martha fired back, her temper finally flaring, which is more than I can say for you right now. Get off my porch, Sheriff. Boyd's eyes narrowed into terrifying slits. You made a big mistake, Martha. This town protects its own, but you just showed us you aren't one of us anymore. The retaliation was swift, silent, and devastating. The next time Martha went into town for groceries, Sarah Jenkins, the clerk who had known Martha for 30 years, refused to make eye contact, scanning her items in stony silence. The Knuckle hardware store suddenly didn't have the parts to fix her broken generator. When her pipes froze again in late February, the town's only plumber claimed he was booked solid until spring. Oak Haven was freezing her out. But the social isolation was merely the preamble to the real nightmare. In early March, a sleek, black Lincoln Town car pulled into her driveway. Out stepped Harrison Caldwell, the manager of the Oak Haven Regional Bank. Harrison was a ruthless, deeply greedy man who had spent the last decade quietly buying up foreclosed properties to sell to out-of-state luxury developers. He had always coveted Martha's land, a sprawling 50 acres with prime, unobstructed views of the Rockies. Harrison sat in her living room, refusing the tea she offered, and pulled a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase. "I'll get straight to the point, Martha," Harrison said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. Before Ethan passed, he took out a substantial line of credit against this property to cover his medical bills. "We've been lenient out of respect for your mourning period. But given your recent poor judgment and the resulting lack of community standing, the bank's board has decided to call in the debt." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. "Call it in? Ethan and I never missed a monthly payment. I just sent the check last week." The terms of a commercial loan allow the bank to demand full repayment at any time if the asset is deemed at risk, Harrison replied, tapping the paperwork. "And an elderly widow living alone, associating with notorious criminal syndicates, is a massive risk. You owe $85,000, Martha, payable in 30 days, or we foreclose and the property goes to public auction." $85,000? Martha gasped, clutching her chest. "Harrison, you know I don't have that kind of money. My pension barely covers the taxes. This is my home. Ethan built this house." "Then you should have thought about your home before you turned it into a clubhouse for outlaws," Harrison said coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. He stood up, towering over her. 30 days, Martha. Pack your things." The following month was a descent into despair. Martha tried everything. She called banks in Denver, but her fixed income and the predatory nature of Ethan's loan made refinancing impossible. She tried to sell off Ethan's tools, his antique furniture, even her wedding ring, but it barely made a dent. The town watched her struggle with vindictive satisfaction. Sheriff Boyd regularly parked his cruiser at the bottom of her road, a silent, intimidating reminder that her time was up. By the night before the foreclosure auction, Martha was broken. She sat in the dark living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes packed with 40 years of memories. She was going to be homeless. The town had won. As she packed a small box of Ethan's desk belongings, a heavy piece of cardstock slipped out of a leather journal and fluttered to the floor. Martha picked it up. It was a stark white business card. No name. Just a winged skull and a single phone number scrawled in black ink on the back. "You ever need anything, you don't call the cops. You don't call the town. You call us." Jim Castiglione's words echoed in her mind. Martha stared at the card for a long time. She was a proud woman. Asking for charity felt like a defeat. But looking around her dismantled life, the sheer, profound injustice of it all ignited a spark of pure, unadulterated anger in her chest. Oak Haven had abandoned her to freeze, just like they would have abandoned those men. Her hands shaking, Martha picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah. Is Jim there?" Martha asked, her voice cracking. "It's Martha Higgins, from Colorado." There was a heavy pause on the line. Then the sound of movement. A moment later, Jim's deep, gravelly voice came through the receiver. "Martha, oh, you hurt?" he asked, the protective intensity in his voice immediate. Tears finally spilled over Martha's cheeks. "No, Jim, I'm not hurt, but I'm losing my home tomorrow morning. The bank, the town, They're taking it all because I helped you." She poured out the whole story. The harassment, the predatory learn, Harrison Caldwell, Sheriff Boyd. Jim didn't interrupt once. He just listened. When she finally finished, sobbing quietly into the receiver, the silence on the other end was absolute. It wasn't an empty silence. It felt heavy, coiled, and dangerous. "What time is the auction, Martha?" Jim asked, his voice deadly calm. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning," she whispered. "Right on my front lawn. But Jim, you can't come here and cause trouble. Boyd has the state police on standby. If you start a fight, they'll lock you away." "We aren't going to start a fight, Martha," Jim replied smoothly. "Get some sleep. Leave the coffee pot on." The morning of April 15th was bitterly cold, the sky a bruised, heavy gray. At 9:30, the vultures arrived. Harrison Caldwell pulled his Lincoln onto the lawn, stepping out in a pristine tailored suit, holding a clipboard. Sheriff Boyd Miller was right behind him, accompanied by 3 deputies, all resting their hands conspicuously on their gun belts. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered at the edge of the property, eager to watch the disgraced widow finally get what she deserved. Martha stood on her porch, wrapped in Ethan's flannel coat, her face pale and drawn. "Morning, Martha," Harrison said cheerfully, stepping up to the porch. "I see you've got your boxes ready." "Good. Let's make this quick and painless. We'll open the bidding at $85,000 to cover the bank's losses." "Nobody is bidding," Harrison, Boyd chuckled, looking back at the handful of gossiping locals. "It's just you. The bank gets the deed, and we can finally clean up this property." Harrison cleared his throat, raising his voice for the legal formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, this property is hereby up for public auction. The bank opens the bidding at $85,000. Do I hear 85? 85 is on the table," Harrison smiled, preparing to bang a small wooden gavel against the porch railing. "Going once. Rumble." Harrison froze. Boyd's head snapped toward the highway. It started as a low vibration in the soles of their shoes. Then it grew into a deafening, thunderous roar that shook the pine needles from the trees. The townspeople at the bottom of the driveway began to back away in terror. Over the crest of the hill came a single, massive Harley-Davidson, ridden by a giant of a man in a leather cut. Behind him was another, and another, and another. They poured over the hill like a mechanical tidal wave. It wasn't 20 men this time. It was a staggering, endless column of heavy American iron. There were at least 150 bikers, riding in tight, disciplined 2x2 formation. The sheer volume of the roaring engines was physically overwhelming, drowning out every other sound in the valley. Sheriff Boyd went pale, instinctively unfastening the safety strap on his holster. His 3 deputies looked like they were about to bolt. The procession turned up Martha's driveway surrounding the property, parking in perfectly synchronized rows on the dying grass. The engines cut out one by one, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Jim Castiglione dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was flanked by Tiny, Rusty, and a sharp-looking man in a meticulously tailored gray suit who looked entirely out of place among the leather and denim. The sea of bikers parted as Jim walked straight up to the porch, ignoring the trembling sheriff completely. He stopped in front of Martha, giving her a slow, respectful nod. "Morning, Martha," Jim said gently. "Hope we aren't late." Martha, utterly speechless, shook her head, a watery smile breaking across her face. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Boyd finally exploded, his voice shaking. "Castiglione, you and your gang of thugs are trespassing. I will have every single one of you arrested." Jim didn't even look at the sheriff. He turned his heavy gaze to Harrison Caldwell, who was sweating profusely despite the cold. "It's a public auction, isn't it?" Jim asked, his voice echoing across the silent yard. "Open to the public. We're the public." The man in the gray suit stepped forward, opening a leather briefcase. "My name is David Sterling," the man said crisply. I am the retained legal counsel for the Hells Angels Motorcycle Corporation. We are here to participate in the legal acquisition of this property. Harrison swallowed hard. The opening bid is $85,000. Certified funds only. We bid $150,000, Jim stated flatly. The townspeople at the bottom of the hill gasped. Harrison stared at him, stunned. 150? Sir, you have to prove you have the funds. Tiny stepped forward and unzipped a massive heavy canvas duffel bag, dropping it onto the porch right at Harrison's feet. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. Inside were stacks of perfectly banded, non-sequential $100 bills. Count it, Jim ordered, his eyes boring into the corrupt banker. Or do you want to counterbid on behalf of your bank? No. Harrison looked at the money, then up at the 150 massive, scowling bikers surrounding him. He knew he was beaten. The bank's board had only authorized him to bid up to $90,000 to secure the land. No, Harrison choked out, his face purple with humiliation. No counterbid. The property is sold. Sign the deed transfer, the lawyer demanded, pulling a pen and a stack of legal documents from his briefcase. Now, with shaking hands, Harrison signed the paperwork. As soon as the ink was dry, he practically threw the clipboard at the lawyer, scurrying back to his Lincoln and speeding down the driveway, leaving Boyd and his deputies standing alone among the bikers. Boyd puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his authority. Fine. You bought the land, but I promise you, Castiglione, if you try to set up a criminal compound here, I will raid this place every single day. Jim finally looked at the sheriff, a dark, terrifying smile spreading across his face. We didn't buy the land, Sheriff. Jim took the deed from his lawyer. He turned to Martha, placing the heavy manila envelope into her trembling hands. We bought the debt, Jim corrected softly, looking down at the widow. The deed is in Martha's name. Free and clear. Nobody can ever take this house from her again. Martha looked down at the paperwork, a sob tearing from her throat. She looked up at Jim, tears streaming down her face. Jim, I can't accept this. This is a fortune. You saved 20 of my brothers, Jim said, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't judge us. You didn't turn us away. In our world, loyalty is paid in full. Consider this your husband's final mechanic fee. He reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek with his calloused thumb. But that's not all, Jim announced, turning back to the crowd. My lawyer here just filed the paperwork this morning. We bought the 20 acres of useless, undeveloped rock right behind your property line, Martha. We're building a permanent chapter retreat. Sheriff Boyd's face went entirely white. Jim stared directly at Boyd, his voice dropping to a menacing, protected growl that sent shivers down the spine of every local in earshot. Martha is under our protection now, Jim declared to the town. She is family. Anyone, banker, plumber, neighbor, or badge who gives her a hard time, who fails to treat her with the utmost respect, will have a personal conversation with me and 200 of my brothers. Do we understand each other, Sheriff? Boyd didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply turned, signaling his deputies, and marched off the property in total defeat. The townspeople scattered like frightened mice. Martha stood on her porch, clutching the deed to her home, surrounded by a sea of leather and roaring engines. The town of Oak Haven had tried to freeze her out, to cast her aside as weak and helpless. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that when you show kindness to the devil looks out for his own. Martha's story reminds us that true loyalty often comes from the most unexpected places. While her community abandoned her, the outlaws she saved returned to fiercely protect her, proving that humanity and honor aren't defined by a badge or a clean reputation. If this incredible true story of survival, betrayal, and biker justice moved you, please hit the like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life drama.